Welcome to today's program. My name is Glenn Diesen, and with me is my colleague Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. And the guest today is Chas Freeman, who is a retired U.S. diplomat. So Ambassador Freeman, he served as the Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's had many important roles. One of them in designing the European post-Cold War security system centered around NATO. He worked, if I'm not mistaken, also for the Nixon administration, assisting in reestablishing or developing relations with China. And also, Ambassador Freeman served as the U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, which is also a key U.S. partnership in the Middle East. So this is a very unique background in terms of organizing Europe, relations with Russia, China, Saudi Arabia. So again, it's a real great honor and a pleasure to have him on. So welcome, Chas Freeman.
I'm sorry about that. I will try to silence that. Thank you. You didn't mention that I actually started out with a degree in Latin American studies and never used my Spanish except in negotiating with Fidel Castro to persuade him to leave Angola if we could get the South Africans to leave Namibia, which to everyone's astonishment we did. So I apologize for the interruption. I'm not sure what that was, but
no worries at all. So, the main theme today is really to discuss the changing world order, as all of these things tie together around this. As we know, the post-Cold War order was to a large extent organized around U.S. global primacy, which appears to have come to an end, if not coming to an end. So again, you have some excellent insights here, as we're now experiencing this implosion of the pan-European security architecture with this war in Ukraine. Also, unfortunately, the free fall in U.S.-China relations, risking, hopefully not, but risking a possible military conflict. And we also see the reorganization of the Middle East, but also the fragmentation of the U.S.-Saudi relations, which, hopefully you can inform us what kind of repercussions there will be. But I thought we could start with the most pressing issue, which is what's happening in Europe. Obviously, with this war now in Ukraine. So I wanted to ask you, I guess maybe a bit wide question, but how did we end up with this war, and how has the United States responded to it? And lastly, where is the war going? Sorry for the huge question, but
huge question. In 1993, when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense, I synthesized a program called the Partnership for Peace. I was the original architect of that. It was both a path to NATO membership for the newly independent countries of Eastern Europe, and a potential cooperative versus collective security institution. There was a link to Russia involved in it in the NATO-Russia Council. And Russia was, in fact, invited to join it. The origin of this was interesting. People had a view of what Europe should be, but the only organization that embraced Europe at that time was the OSCE. And the OSCE, of course, included the former Soviet republics of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and whatnot, which by no stretch of the imagination were European. So the idea was we shall let Europeans define themselves. If people in let's say Slovakia wish to demonstrate that they are European, they have to do two things. First, they have to conform to Western European standards for the parliamentary supervision of the defense budget and a civilian minister of defense. In other words, conform to the political military culture that defines Western Europe and NATO. And second, they had to learn the 3,000 standardization agreements, or STANAGs, which enable people from different nationalities speaking different languages to cooperate in military operations. Military operations in support of peacekeeping or disaster relief are not fundamentally different from those involved in warfare. So that was the idea. That fell afoul of two things. Domestic American electoral politics, with ethnic groups insisting on the immediate admission of their favorite country, their ancestral homeland, to NATO, without regard to their conditions. And second, revanchism, in fact, a kind of triumphalism on the part of neoconservatives in the United States and their fellow travelers in Europe, which altered the plan. With respect to Ukraine, the idea originally was, well, there were two uncertainties. One was, would the Baltics join NATO? And the answer there that we had when we came up with this idea was, if Russia does not object, yes. If it is acceptable to Russia, yes. And in fact, it did prove acceptable to Russia. With Ukraine, we had a different calculation. We imagined Ukraine would wish to learn the Stanags to become militarily interoperable with NATO, but would not seek to join NATO because that would be a strategic provocation that would bring in a Russian intervention. So we understood, this is 1993, this is 30 years ago, we understood very well what would happen if Ukraine were admitted to NATO, especially if it failed to meet any of the criteria for that. What happened, how we got to this mess, is a push from our side, that is NATO, the United States, to bring in every country that had become independent of the former Soviet Empire in Europe, Georgia first, then Ukraine, regardless of their conditions. And this brings me to the point that this began with a Russian effort massing forces on Ukraine's border and demanding negotiations on European security architecture, the very issue that I've just discussed. I didn't consider that unreasonable at all. I also thought that if we failed to address the Russian negotiation proposal, they would, in fact, take some sort of military action. What it was, I did not know. In the event, after they were stiff-armed, they did act, and I think they acted in a way which may prove tragic for themselves. I think that decision to invade Ukraine, which appears to me to have been a last-minute decision, no prior briefing of generals, no lineup of logistics, no briefing of troops, no effort to address the nature of the mission, to send the troops over the border in 3 different columns. This seems to me to have been the greatest strategic blunder by a Russian government since their decision to go to war with Japan in 1904, which had ultimate tragic consequences for the Tsar and his regime. So how did we get here? We got here through a series of blunders, misjudgments, none of which should have happened. There should have been talks with the Russians. If you sit down at the table to talk to someone, as I know from my diplomatic experience, you are not necessarily there to agree with them or to accept what they're proposing. But at least you listen and you try to understand their position. You exercise a bit of empathy and you try to figure out how you can square the differences between you in a way that leaves both sides better off than they were before. We did none of that. And I have to say, in criticizing my own country's diplomatic style at the moment, it does not appear that we know how to do that. I look at the disastrous encounter between Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Sullivan in Anchorage with the Chinese at the outset of the Biden administration. I look at the botched effort to restore restraints on Iranian nuclear programs. I look at the absence of dialogue with North Korea, where maximum pressure policy has produced an ICBM with a nuclear warhead capable of striking our homeland, the American homeland. So I'm not impressed by how we got to this point. But I do say, and I apologize for going on so long, but I do say my sense is that a combination of factors, war fatigue, the increasing evidence that sanctions are counterproductive rather than productive in terms of altering the shape of the world to our advantage, and the revelation that we are living in a positive ocean of war propaganda with very little access to facts are all combining to increase interest in finding a way to end this war. I see various proposals for peace coming out, most of them pretty unrealistic, but I suppose we should talk about that.
It seems to me, Ambassador, that what you are saying is a collapse of diplomacy and the need for a return to one, because there hasn't been much in the way of diplomacy for some time. But now, perhaps the situation on the ground in Ukraine and the situation with the sanctions might finally persuade people that diplomacy, which I think has almost been treated as something akin to appeasement, that if you are talking to the other side, doing what you said, showing some kind of empathy towards them, you are appeasing evil in some fashion. I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric that I personally am encountering all the time when I say, we need to look for some kind of way out, some kind of interactions. People always bring up this appeasement issue, but that's what we need to get through to. And I mean, you've spoken with the Russians, you've had dealings with the Russians, you've spoken with Ukrainians, you've spoken with all of these people. And I think that this rhetoric of evil, of black and white, and all of those things that we managed to trap ourselves into has done an enormous amount of harm. But it is going to be very, very difficult to get some of our electorates now that they've been hearing all of this for so long, to suddenly change their mood and to turn around and say, well, perhaps you're telling us one day we can't talk to Putin, he's evil. Why are we therefore talking to him now? It's going to be very difficult to do that without experiencing some degree of disorientation, or so it seems to me. At least in Britain, it would be.
I think you're right. Although I would argue that from a diplomatic point of view, there are 4 issues here to be resolved. And the question of the US-Russian proxy war, which is one of them, is perhaps the easiest to solve. The most difficult one is the war between Ukrainians, because people forget that this began as a civil war between Ukrainians who insisted on that Russian-speaking Ukrainians speak only Ukrainian for official purposes and educate their children in Ukrainian. And this fissure between Ukrainian purists and Russian-speaking Ukrainians was in evidence right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the efforts of the Crimea to declare independence from Ukraine and to become a constituency of the Russian Federation. And it certainly was in evidence in 2014 with the reaction to the coup in Kyiv. So this is a fundamental problem. It was, however, addressed quite skillfully on a theoretical level at Minsk in the 2 agreements. But it's very significant that Russia accepted that despite its concern for its fellow Russian speakers in Ukraine, a federal structure in Ukraine that would give them, let's say, the rights of the Quebecois in Canada French-speaking Canadians, or Swiss canton, or Walloons versus others in Belgium, this would be acceptable. And it was a separate issue from the question of where Ukraine fit in European security architecture. But this issue of how to compose differences among Ukrainians has become ever more complicated. The Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine have been subjected to almost a decade of bombardment, and the level of blood that's been shed on both sides now has embittered things to such a level that we hear people in Kyiv saying that when, they never say if, they liberate the Donbass, etc., they plan to hold trials for treason of anyone who collaborated with the Russians. And they insist that they will impose a Ukrainian language-only policy. Well, you couldn't find a more effective way of preventing any kind of deal than that. What's in it for the Russian-speaking Ukrainians to agree to be tried for treason, or to give up the language rights that they first asserted in their secession? So that's one thing. There are 4 wars. That's the first. The second is one between the Russian state and, I'm sorry about that, Russian state and the Ukrainian state. There we have, an unwillingness to talk on both sides. But Mr. Zelensky says essentially that there must be regime change in Moscow before he will negotiate with Russia, which is, again, an instance of complete failure to lay the basis for any sort of negotiation. The third war is the proxy war between the US and Russia, and we could call that off. I'm speaking of the United States, we could call that off. Although you're quite right, the level of war propaganda and indoctrination that we've all suffered, the degree of passion that has become invested in this issue, are such that it would require extraordinary leadership on the part of our president and senior members of our legislature, and I don't see it. So I'm sorry to say I don't see it in the UK either. And the final war, of course, is the one between Europeans about how to organize a stable peace in Europe. This is NATO versus Russia, I suppose. NATO now including Finland, and potentially including Sweden as well. So that instead of uniting Europe in a cooperative security arrangement as the Partnership for Peace envisaged, Europe is being united in a collective security organization directed at Russia. And just as we see elsewhere, the greater the effort to rely on military deterrence, the greater the response in military terms from those who are being deterred. And so we're in an arms race. We're in an escalation cycle that has to be broken. And this all comes back, Mr. Mercouris, if I may call you Alex, it all comes back to the question you raised of what is the outcome of the oft-rumored, never fully evident offensives by the two sides going to be. The Russians are running a meat grinder along the Ukrainian frontier. Ukrainians are now beginning to raid over the Dnieper, apparently, probably probing for weak points for the so-called offensive they assert they will launch. I have to say, in all my experience of wars, and as an American, I've been involved in many wars. I don't ever recall an instance where offensives were trumpeted for such long a time as this. That didn't happen. There's a Chinese expression, a loud loud noise was heard on the stairs, but nobody came down. And that seems to apply here.
This might be the that in this instance, as this is also a proxy war, the need to advertise for a great offensive is necessary to get the equipment you need for the offensive. So I guess it's all tied in together. I also like the way you structure this into 4 different wars, because it also appears that what makes this even more complicated is a lot of these wars are they're connected among the different layers. So, for example, many people don't remember that back in 1994, in January, Bill Clinton, he made a speech recognizing if we decide to expand NATO, this may redivide Europe between East and West, and this would have conflicts. I mean, this wasn't very controversial at the time as a statement. I mean, this is what William Perry, Jack Matlock, George Kennan, they all cautioned that Russia would again strengthen, and this would cancel the post-Cold War peace. But what I thought was interesting is that NATO unity, I think, to some extent required some strategic ambiguity, because the Western Europeans weren't comfortable to have a NATO aimed against Russia. So, for them, we focused on reassurance, so that this is not a tool against Russia. While the Eastern Europeans, they wanted security guarantees against Russia. So the message was the opposite. Yes, this is insurance guarantee against Russia. So I think that's why once NATO is forced to abandon this ambiguity, it unavoidably will cause some divisions within. We see that now with Poland wanting a stronger role for NATO within Ukraine. But I'm also thinking what you discussed with this proxy war, because obviously the nationalists in Ukraine, they have a lot of power, and I think we saw it after the Minsk peace agreement. They were very clear they would never accept this, and I think that's also the NATO countries. We obviously leaned more towards the nationalists there. And also after Zelensky got elected with 73% of the vote, running on a huge peace platform. So he got this huge peace mandate. But then again, nationalists came out, warned him against pursuing this. And again, I think the conflict between NATO or US and Russia, that yet again, we favored the nationalists vetoing this peace effectively. So I was just wondering how you see this, the extent to which this would then be conceptualized as a proxy war, because I remember when first Russia invaded, this was considered a controversial pro-Russian or Putinist statement. But since I've seen people like Lindsey Graham arguing, yes, this is a great format we have. We supply the weapons and Zelensky will fight to the last man. We have Mitch McConnell argued we shouldn't get lost in idealism. This is not about Ukrainians. This is about destroying Russia. You heard the same from retired General Kellogg saying, this is a good war. We're killing Russians with Ukrainians. And I know, the retired general in Germany as well, Harold Kuyat, has also argued the same, that this was, that we kind of sabotaged all the possible peace agreements with Russia even after the invasion, so we could keep this going. So I was just wondering, how do you see this? Is this as a proxy war? Will we? Well, what would it take to come to bring this to an end? Is it merely running out of weapons? Because I actually read an article today in Politico where they argue that peace might break out in Ukraine, because if we don't have any more weapons to send, we may have to ask them to sit down and talk to Russia. Is that the only way we can end the proxy war? Or
well, that is a possibility, because certainly this war, which in its intensity of infantry and artillery exchanges resembles nothing so much as World War I, has demonstrated conclusively that the West, the United States, Europe, are not prepared for this kind of war. We've become used to fighting people who don't have air forces and who hide in caves and have lice in their beards, and we're not prepared to fight a modern force, even one that has shown itself to be as flawed as the Russian forces have. But I think you raise a very important question implicitly before I get to the question of how the proxy war gets called off. I think there are divisions between Europeans and Americans on the purposes of this war. They have been papered over by common passion against the obvious Russian transgressions of international law and borders and alleged atrocities, perhaps real atrocities, in Ukraine. But they're only papered over. In the end, I think what Europeans probably want is something closer to the concert of Europe than to a divided continent. We don't know how the division will, if there is one, ultimately, we don't know what it will look like. Will it look like the Korean demilitarized zone, a strip of land that separates forces? Will it look like the line of actual control in Kashmir? That's a possibility. Will it not? Will it consist of something like the continuation of the Chinese Civil War during the Cold War, when on alternate days artillery fired at the mainland from Jinmen, Quemoy, or at Quemoy from the mainland? So there was a symbolic war continuing, which involved artillery fire, but very few people were injured. It was symbolic of a divide, which hasn't gone away, by the way. So we don't know. How could this end on the proxy war level? It could end, frankly, with political developments in my own country. There's a fair part of the Republican Party now that does not believe that the United States should be the world policeman, believes Europeans should be responsible for European defense, backed by us, perhaps, but there were moves at the end of the Trump administration to remove U.S. forces from Europe entirely and adopt an offshore balancing approach. There are demands, some of which are being met, for defense budget increases in Europe. Those defense budget increases, let's say the fact that Germany is now rearming, in a sense, reflects hedging as well as other factors. Are the Americans really reliable? Why do we have to secede all authority to Washington? So there is a possibility of the political plug being pulled by an erratic American political system. That's one thing. And then I agree, the lack of weaponry, as well as the growing lack of manpower in Ukraine, is putting quite a bit of pressure on for it to find some way to bring this to an end. I think there are 9 million Ukrainians who have fled Ukraine and gone elsewhere, Europe and Latin America, and the United States. There's a very large number who are displaced. There are just as many draft dodgers from Ukraine as there are from Russia going abroad. And so each one of these wars, the war between Ukrainians, the proxy war, the war between Europeans over security architecture, is wobbly at the moment, I think.
I was just going to ask Ambassador, I was going to just make basically 2 quick points and then maybe a further question. The first is this, which is that it seemed to me from your introduction about the discussions you gave about the structures, the security structures that were being created in the 1990s, that the security architecture that was envisaged, not just by yourself, but I must assume by the administration you served at the time for Europe, was profoundly different from the one we eventually ended up with.
Right.
And I have to say, I wonder how it came about. I mean, you've made some suggestions, electoral considerations, triumphalism on some people. But I do still ask myself how it changed so completely, how the ideas that were being put together then were sort of evolved into something so different and so radically different from what was understood in the 1990s as being necessary to sustain the peace. And by the way, which I think, if they'd been followed through, would have sustained the peace. I mean, I remember that time very well. That's the first thing. And the second point is that this different security architecture that we have with this not just ever expanding NATO, but with a NATO which has become very heavily informed, if I have to say it, by neocon rhetoric. I don't want to specifically talk about some particular individuals, but you can see the kind of language that's used all the time. I can't help but think that you were talking about the internal conflict in Ukraine. When you have that kind of rhetoric, when you have those kind of policies, what it is doing, at least so it seems to me, is inflaming those internal problems in Ukraine. Those who want to pursue maximalist objectives in Ukraine have no disincentive from doing so. The same applies to some politicians, by the way, in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic states, increasingly, and I feel dangerously, in Poland. They feel that they can now pursue the most extreme positions because they sense that whatever they do, however they go about doing it, they will have the West behind them. How do you educate people to understand how dangerous this is? And how did it come about, first of all? I mean, this is maybe a too big a question, maybe not an appropriate or proper question. But what happened within the United States that caused people to change their views about this so completely? Was it some shift within the State Department, some change in the Defense Department, all of these things? And just to quickly finish and say, this idea of ending the war when we've run out of weapons. I've never been a military person. All I can say is, from my point of view, I would not want to be in a position where my country, if I had responsibility for it, was obliged to end a proxy war or any kind of war for a reason like that.
Those are very complex questions there. I would say three questions there. The first on what happened. I think one should not underestimate the change in Mr. Clinton, President Clinton, from 1994, which was, by the way, the year in which Boris Yeltsin first warned against NATO enlargement and its consequences, and 1996, when there was a midterm election, when there was an election in the United States for president, and he had to appeal to the numerous Eastern European and other voters in our country. But there's a bigger issue here that is never mentioned, and that is, if you recall that period after the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union dissolving, and first the empire going in 1989, and then 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolving. There was this phrase replying to NATO, out of area or out of business. And along came Afghanistan, which was a NATO operation. Now, this is a very peculiar thing because this is a response, of course, to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which are the first time that Article 5 of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty, was ever invoked. But NATO was conceived not as an expeditionary force to go into Southwest Asia, but as a defense of Europe against the hordes to the east. And by the way, I can tell you my own doubts which were never very great, I have to say, during the Cold War about the seriousness of the threat from the Red Army were entirely dispelled when I talked to the Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, and others, Hungarians, about the Partnership for Peace and what it was. I had a meeting in Garmisch, and after the meeting, the Czech, he was the head of the armed forces, asked me if I'd like to go for a walk in the town. And we went walking in the town, and he said, well, this is Hilda's dress shop, and her husband Hans over there has this butcher shop, and so on. I said, well, how do you know? I mean, you come here often, but how do you know all this? He said, never been here in my life, but I was trained to occupy the place. And I found the Hungarians spoke perfect Italian for the same reason. Anyway, there was a reality there. Now, that reality changed in 1991, but our mentality did not. And NATO did, in due course, become an expeditionary offensive force rather than simply a defensive alliance. We saw that in Afghanistan. We saw it with the NATO members joining the coalition of the billing in Iraq. We saw it with the intervention in Libya, which was an a la carte NATO operation. We saw it with the detachment of Kosovo from Serbia, which set the precedent for the Crimean transfer to Russia. So what happened was a lot of change. One thing didn't change. My country has two great oceans on either side of it. And as Bismarck remarked, we are very fortunate because to our north, we have the mild-mannered, excruciatingly polite Canadians. And to the south, we have wonderfully rambunctious and joyous Mexicans whom we beat in a war and who don't have any intention of attacking us. And our neighbors to the east and west are fish. Now, if you are a German, a French, anyone in the great plain that extends from the Pyrenees to Kamchatka, you have a very different circumstance. We never learned that if you shoot artillery over the border, somebody shoots back. And therefore, you should make war the last resort. For most Americans, war is a video game. Happens far away on some screen. Very few people get hurt on our side. Lots of people die on the other side. And what's wrong with that? Anyway, so I think there were illusions, delusions. There were residual animosities that carried over. There was a lack of understanding of the way the world was changing. To come to grips with the transformation of the Soviet Union with its messianic ideology and international communist support versus Russian Federation, which differs only from Ukraine in that Putin has brought the oligarchs to heel, whereas in Ukraine there's some question about whether the oligarchs are not still pulling the strings from Mr. Zelensky. So those are my ideas about why this happened, but I am not gifted with total understanding of anything, and I think you're right. This is a mystery.
I thought your comment on this NATO going out of area or out of business is quite important, because during the Cold War, when NATO was a status quo power for defensive alliance, solidarity made countries feel safe or secure that we would stand together in defense. But I think after the Cold War, where NATO became more revisionist by not just expanding but also abandoning this status as a defensive alliance by going against Yugoslavia, Libya, Afghanistan, I think this solidarity, or it comes with some danger, because what I feel now is a lot of these small European countries, my own, Norway included, there's a sense of impunity that we can do anything we want these days. I mean, we're a small country, us 5 million, and this very, very aggressive rhetoric as well as policies now towards Russia. And the assumption is that they can't really do anything because they won't dare because NATO is here. But I think what we often miss is that this creates a dilemma for the Russians, because on one hand, yes, they don't want to have a shooting war with NATO. On the other hand, if countries very openly say, we have to send as much weapons as possible, the only way this war can end is if as many Russians die as possible. Like, this is a very crazy rhetoric, but again, it's with impunity. So I think at some point it's also a risk if Russia doesn't impose any costs, if it allows countries, if you will, to attack with this impunity. So they're kind of faced with a dilemma now. Do we give fire a warning shot, or do we avoid? Because both comes with certain risk, I think.
You're discussing the issue of co-belligerency, and we are definitely co-belligerents. You don't have to talk about proxy war. Under international law and practice, that has consequences. And you're absolutely right. The Russians face a dilemma on this. But I know I began by noting the escalation of Ukrainian aims, trying people for treason and so forth. I have to say, although Mr. Stoltenberg does not represent Norway, he just made his maiden voyage to Kiev and proclaimed that everybody agreed Ukraine was going to come into NATO. Well, that is, of course, the very casus belli that led the Russians to do the foolish thing they did. It does seem to me that we have a contrary trend. I myself feel that the depletion of weaponry, the war fatigue, the growing evidence that sanctions are ineffective, the consequences that flow from the division of the world that follows from our lumping China and Russia together, and the reaction from what's sometimes called the global South, what my friend Sergei Karaganov in Moscow calls the global majority, which I think is correct. He's not correct about many things, but I think he's correct about that. These things are all putting pressure on us to find a way to end the war. But at the same time, we're seeing an escalation in war aims. There never were clear war aims. So it's fine to move the goalposts. We're seeing that. So that is not promising. And if I were Ukrainian, I would be very distressed because everything depends on my willingness to die for a cause that's probably not going to be realized.
Well, I know, you switched to it to Asia, and I thought, because we should try to tie some of this together as well, because you're not just an expert on European security. You obviously have your background from with China as well, from your days with Nixon and thereafter. I was just wondering that, yes, we now see the US and China appearing to move closer to military conflict. The Beijing's perspective, at least, would be that the reason for this, in their view, is that the US is gradually undermining this, 4 decades long one China principle, which was the foundation for relations, but also security in East Asia, in which the US now is seen to be backing away from this idea that there's only one China and Taiwan's a part of it. So I was just wondering, do you agree with this perspective from Beijing, that the United States is supporting Taiwanese secession, or do you see other elements contributing to this conflict between the Americans and the Chinese?
Well, I think the framework that I helped work out as a junior diplomat and later as a more senior one with the Chinese to manage the fact that the Chinese Civil War had not ended. It was suspended by American military intervention in 1950 for very good reasons. We didn't want the Korean War to expand beyond Korea. So we put the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait to stop the forces from the mainland attacking Taiwan, and Chiang Kai-shek's residual forces in Taiwan from counterattacking the mainland. So that froze the Civil War, suspended it, it didn't end it. And between 1971, when Kissinger made his secret visit to Beijing, 72 when Nixon went, 79 when at the end of 78 when we normalized relations with Beijing, and 82 when we reached an agreement on how to manage arms sales to Taiwan. We worked out a framework that persuaded the Chinese, this is not an urgent problem. Yes, it is your civil war. Yes, we will accept a peaceful settlement of this civil war. Inevitably, that means some kind of reunification. What sort of reunification takes place is up to you to work out with your fellow Chinese, and we won't interfere. Well, all of those things are gone. The entire framework has collapsed. We agreed no official relations with Taipei, but we now treat it very much as though we had diplomatic relations with it. There's a building, $230 million building in Taipei with a Marine Guard in it that is indistinguishable from an embassy. So we've broken that part of the agreement. We agreed not to undertake to defend Taiwan, but merely to provide it with the weapons it needed to defend itself. But we now have a president who on 4 occasions has asserted that we will defend Taiwan. We said we would not have any military troops or installations on the island, and we now have both. So we have created a triple act. So from the Chinese point of view, yes, this is a betrayal of understandings that were crucial to maintaining the peace. Why did that happen? It happened in large measure for 2 reasons. First, if you're Taipei, the alternative capital of China, which for 23 years we insisted was the capital of all of China, including Mongolia, they're number 2, and they tried harder. They're very good at diplomacy, public diplomacy, and otherwise, and more power to them. The second, under the framework that we worked out with Beijing, Taiwan was able to drop martial law and to democratize. And it is now a robust democracy, and therefore it has a great deal of ideological sympathy in the United States and elsewhere in the democratic world. When we normalized with Beijing, Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek was an authoritarian, not to say quasi-totalitarian system. It's now democratic. Beijing, which appeared to be moving toward greater liberalism, has retrogressed and become more authoritarian. So the ideological element, which disappeared for a while, is back with a vengeance. Are we going to get into a war? Very likely, because when you weigh the possibility of war, you must weigh what I call the balance of fervor. Which side cares the most about the outcome? Now, if you were North Vietnamese, it turned out you cared a lot more about the unity of your country than Americans did about keeping it disunited. And the same equation operates in the Taiwan Strait. To the extent we have come to base our policy toward Taiwan entirely on military deterrence. That creates a security dilemma. Everything that we do is seen by Beijing as a threat, and they respond. How do they respond? They have a rapidly growing economy still, although it's slowing down. Their defense budget has kept pace with the GDP, which has brought them to the point where they, in nominal dollar terms, are spending a huge amount of money, about a third of what we're spending. In purchasing power parity terms, it's probably equal. And there's a lot of wishful thinking. And again, going back to the shortage of weaponry in the military-industrial complex's inability to supply the war in Ukraine, many Americans imagine that we could reenact World War II, where we were in a depression and we were able to surge production of military equipment on a colossal scale, building a 6,000-ship Navy, for example, turning out 1 tank every hour. This is not going to happen. China's industrial production now equals that of the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. When people talk about GDP comparisons, what they're talking about inadvertently is what they're saying is, well, the United States has many more lawyers, tax accountants, insurance bureaucrats, and academicians than the Chinese. They don't talk about, how many ships do you build, how much steel do you produce, how much concrete do you lay down, what is your capability for surge? Chinese defense spending is about 1.5% of GDP. Our defense budget is well over 3%, but our defense budget is only 60% of the total because we put other money in things like the Department of Energy for nuclear weapons and the Veterans Affairs Department to pay for past wars and dual-use functions like the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the intelligence community. And we add all that up, it's $1.5 trillion a year, which is colossal, absolutely colossal. But the level of spending does not determine the level of fighting ability, as we should have learned in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and we are learning in Ukraine. I mean, after all, Europe and America together dwarf Russia in military terms, and yet the Russians are able to give a good account of themselves. And I recall, as an American in World War II, Japan had a GDP that was 10% of that of the United States, and it gave us a good run for the money for 4 years. So there are many factors here. They all point, unfortunately, in the direction of some sort of terrible train wreck. What we see at the moment is the Chinese having drawn a lesson from Ukraine, which is most unfortunate. Namely, if you have an overwhelming nuclear deterrent, you can fight a conventional war with another nuclear power. And this is why you're seeing the plus up of the ICBM force out in the Gobi Desert. They are preparing the nuclear cover for a possible conventional war over Taiwan, which they don't want. They have made every effort to put forward reasonable negotiating positions. But as Alex said earlier, if the United States is prepared to guarantee that whatever happens, you're safe, then you have no incentive to be cautious. And you certainly have no incentive to negotiate. Just as Europeans had no incentive to build up defense budgets or insist on a different path to European security architecture, why bother? Everything was just fine. Well, this is not a good formula. The final point I would make is that the two issues, that is the Taiwan issue and the Ukraine issue, have something in common. They're both about spheres of influence. Taiwan is in the American sphere of influence. We have determined we want to keep it that way, evidently. Ukraine was not in the American sphere of influence called NATO. We determined that we wanted to include it. So one of the many reversals of black and white that one hears in the analysis of the Ukraine issue is this is about Russia trying to impose a sphere of influence on Ukraine. No, it was Russia trying to deny the other side of the sphere of influence in Ukraine, which would allow the basing of weapons systems on Russia's doorstep. So the Chinese want to get rid of the American sphere of influence. Why? Two revolutions in China in the 20th century were about this: ending foreign spheres of influence on Chinese soil, ending the humiliation of China by foreign forces. Taiwan brings all of that out on a daily basis as an issue, and it adds the Japanese factor. Chinese believe 35 million Chinese died at the hands of the Japanese during their 14-year rampage through China. Others say, well, no, it was only 25 million. But everybody in North and Central China lost somebody. So old, nostalgic, irrational memories count, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well.
I have to say, listening to what you've just been saying, Ambassador, that when it comes to relations with China, there is a rather troubling sense of deja vu. It's the same kind of mistakes and misconceptions in policy that have led to a great extent. I'm not saying that the other side is completely innocent and hasn't made its own mistakes, but we, and in Britain, we are there too, not perhaps centrally, but we have been making the same mistakes with the Chinese as we've been making with the Russians, except that the stakes, if possible, are even higher. When people talk about an armed clash between the United States and China, and they talk about it as something that might actually happen and happen soon, I have to say, I find that so extraordinary that it just astonishes me that people are able to talk about it as calmly as they are. I mean, the idea of a war between China and the United States, I would have thought would be a horrifying thing, that the priority on both sides would be to try and find some way to avoid it, even if that does require compromises and looking back to solutions. And you were involved, as it turns out, in both the setting up of the original relationship with China, which worked very well for a very long time. You were involved in the setting up of the original relationships in Europe, which I think could have succeeded in keeping peace there in Europe. Why don't people look back at those things and say to themselves, surely going back to that, accepting, that Taiwan, well, we're not going to sort it out. We let's not say that's, going to be an independent country. It's too dangerous to do that. Let's accept that the Chinese have concerns. Why not go back to that kind of thinking instead of risking things in this extraordinary way by talking oneself into a war with China? Anyway, I've spoken perhaps a bit.
So your Mr. Cleverly is about to give a clever speech, I understand, or maybe he already did, about why post-Brexit Britain does have to reposition itself with regard to China and can't blindly follow the United States, although that is not probably the way he phrased it. So I, as an American, I'm acutely aware of the fact that you cannot achieve self-determination without the agreement of the mother country. We gave Britain the bird back in 1776, and there were 5 years of very vicious warfare, at the end of which nobody remembers, but 1/3 of the white population of what is now the United States fled. They went back to Britain, they went to the Bahamas, the West Indies, they went to Australia, they went to New Zealand. Anyway, and then it took 2 years at the negotiating table in Versailles to get the grudging agreement of His Majesty's government to the uppity independence of Americans. So when Taiwan says, well, we're entitled to self-determination, I say, sure, as long as you can get Beijing's agreement. And you're certainly not going to get Beijing's agreement by putting an American garrison in your midst. But the point you've made, I would, perhaps as a former diplomat, I would entirely predictably answer. What these things have in common is the total repudiation of diplomacy. Putin says we have a problem. We need to reach an agreement about how to have a peaceful, stable Europe. Russia's got 1 foot in Europe and 1 out. Now it's got 2 feet out, I guess. We need to deal with this. And we say, we're not going to talk to you about that. We'll talk to you about Tomahawk launchers, maybe, if you're good. And we say to the Chinese, we are not on speaking terms with the Chinese. Our Secretary of State can't go to China Mr. Xi Jinping will not answer the phone from Mr. Biden. And the former Chinese ambassador, a very professional man, just at a conference in Shanghai said, why should we have a meeting? What's the point of a meeting where one side habitually lies? Why should we take that seriously? Because we're claiming we still have a one China policy when demonstrably we don't. Lip service will only carry you so far. I think it is true, by the way, Nixon, who was a very strange man, I knew him close up, but a very gifted advocate and negotiator, once said that, it's not true that it's always better to talk than not to talk. It depends on whether you know what to say. I don't think we know what to say on any of these issues, frankly. So Mr. Stoltenberg does seem to me to represent the broad issue. And I must say, Mr. Medvedev in Moscow is, equally provocative, or more so. This is an impasse with no obvious immediate solution except the one that you, Alex, raised at the beginning, which is, how do these offensives work out if there are real offensives?
It's interesting how Dmitry Medvedev has become quite hawkish. He does actually remind me a bit about Jens Stoltenberg at the moment. But he wasn't always like this, though, because, again, I think a key reason why we don't have anything to say to the Chinese is, and we don't have any solutions with the Russians, is because we are this difficult transition, because we're moving now, again, from global primacy into a multipolar system, and we're not quite sure how to what language to even use. But speaking of President Medvedev, in 2008, as the president of Russia, he proposed this new principle. He said that in the new era, we have to replace spheres of influence with spheres of interest. Now, and I thought this was interesting, because often when you talk about countries like Ukraine, it's always in this zero-sum game. That is, either they belong to the Western sphere of influence or the Russian sphere of influence. But what he argued was that the sphere of interest concept would be very different. It simply meant if sphere of influence is conceptualized as exclusive influence and dominance, sphere of interest would merely mean that what happens along your border is of vital interest to you. So, in other words, Western powers can go as much as they want to Ukraine, do whatever deals they want. However, when they're operating on the Russian border, they have to take their interest into consideration. So I thought this was quite a kind of interesting concept, because this looks like the arrangement for Mexico as well. Because Mexico, under no stretch of the imagination, is under a sphere of influence. They have freedom to do mostly what they want. However, they do not have the freedom to join hostile anti-American military alliances, because when you operate on the American border, you respect their security. So I thought the sphere of influence concept was, sphere of interest concept was quite conducive or helpful to conceptualize what a multipolar world order might be. Furthermore, I think that global primacy can be based on this alliance systems. It's very difficult to have stability with alliance systems in a multipolar world, because, and also, as we discussed, world order after the main experience has been, you need the inclusive security architecture. So the lesson after the Napoleonic Wars, obviously establishing the concept of Europe, was you bring in the defeated party, France, and even after World War II.
We failed after World War I, with terrible consequences. Yeah,
terrible. That was after World War I, trying to keep the peace in Europe by having perpetually weakened Germany, obviously also a bad idea. And that lesson could be fixed after World War II by bringing in the Germans, despite the atrocities they had committed on the continent. But then we come after the Cold War, and again, from the Russian perspective, and people like Jack Matlock are arguing that Russia wasn't even defeated. It was a diplomatic settlement in '89, and still the historical lesson there.
Russia defaulted on the game. It defaulted. It decided to abandon the pursuit for global hegemony, and it was not defeated. It gave up. That's different. And I think I think Medvedev may very well be accurately depicting a future world. But at the moment, we're in the grips of you're either with us or against us. So we look at countries like India and China, which have assiduously avoided taking sides. We say, well, you're not with us, therefore you must be with the Russians. But I don't think that's the case. The Chinese statement of principles, not a plan, peace plan, but a statement of principles, included prominently up front respect for sovereignty. That was a dig at Mr. Putin. And you talk to Chinese, they will tell you that. It is, at some point, those principles may or may not be the basis for some sort of peace plan. At the moment, it's impossible for all the reasons we've been discussing, and nobody's ready for peace. But I want to say something about spheres of influence and spheres of interest. Spheres of interest are incompatible with you're with us or against us. They assume that there's not one global order. There are many global orders and regional orders. And some of them are economic, some are technological, some are political, some are military, some are cultural. So they can coexist in a single country. And this actually, interestingly, this is a very un-European concept because spheres of influence have been basic to the European explosion into the world, the British Empire and the French Empire, and so on and so forth, and the related German effort to create an empire, and the Japanese effort. These are all very deeply embedded in Western culture. But if you look at the culture of India, pre-British conquest, or you look at the history of China, this is not how they operate. And so they operated in exactly the way that Medvedev predicts, which is, I might be the dominant economic force in Mexico, but Mexico was politically aligned not with me, but with someone else. Mexico, of course, as you said, can't have a military alliance against the United States or a foreign military presence directed against the United States. And you don't have to look to the Cuban Missile Crisis to see the example of that. Most people forget that during our Civil War, the French installed Maximilian of Austria as the Emperor of Mexico. The only legacy of that is mariachi music, mariachi being the Mexican-Spanish pronunciation of mariage or marriage. And when our Civil War was over, the first thing we did was mass 40,000 troops on the Mexican border and say to the French, be gone, or else. And the French, not being stupid, left. Poor Maximilian, 2 years later, died before a firing squad organized by Benito Juarez, the great Mexican liberal. Anyway, I think the world is indeed fragmenting in interesting ways. And multipolarity is not just multipolarity of political alignments. It's multipolarity of economic, technological, cultural, military alignments, and a lot of regional orders that are sub-global, in part because the United States, ironically, has smashed some of the global institutions, the WTO, for example. And this leaves people to work out dispute settlement mechanisms and trade deals, not on a global, but on a regional basis. So we're seeing a fragmentation. And interestingly, I think that this empowers middle-ranking powers in a way that they have not been empowered for perhaps a century. A country like Saudi Arabia, which was very subservient to the United States, now is entirely independent. It will take its own actions based on its own judgments of its interests, whether it's in cooperating with Russia on OPEC plus and oil prices, or whether it's accepting Chinese mediation for some sort of rapprochement with Iran, or whether it is pulling the plug on the effort to depose President Assad in Syria. And so we're seeing this. We saw it with Turkey, which is still a NATO ally nominally, but behaves as though it's in an entente, not an alliance. That is to say, as though it's in a limited partnership for limited purposes, not an across-the-board commitment to mutual defense. And I think we're seeing it with rearmament of Japan and Germany, both of which are hedging. They are developing greater capabilities to support, in the case of Germany, NATO, in the case of Japan, the US-Japan alliance, but at the same time, they're developing greater capacity to act independently of these alliances. So this is a world in evolution, and I don't think it's understood.
Listening to all that, and I agree that it is a world in evolution, but again, one does wonder whether some of the responses that have been made to all of this aren't making that evolution take place in a more disordered and chaotic way than it might necessarily need to be. And we have sanctions now, which are causing major instability in the economic system. We have attempts to impose price caps on oil products. We're talking about Russian oil, but no reason why you can't do it with other countries' oils as well. We see the use of the dollar system in all sorts of ways that are intended to use the dollar to control or to put pressure on countries. And inevitably, people are responding, countries are responding, and they're responding in all sorts of ways. And Glenn was talking about US primacy ending. I really do wonder whether this question of US primacy isn't. It always makes me uncomfortable when people talk about primacy, because the evolution of the system, in my opinion, does not challenge the core interests of the United States. That other countries prosper, that they succeed, that they become, self-supporting, is not a failure of America or a symptom of American decline. It's just a normal process of development and change. But attempting to use all of these tools in order to prevent that development, it seems to me, is potentially creating challenges to American primacy in ways that, as I said, could actually be dangerous and potentially chaotic, and which can make things far more unstable than they need to be.
Well, I entirely agree. I think many of the actions we've taken are reflexive and not thoughtful, and they are counterproductive. And I'll give you an example. Well, there are many examples, but I think the resort to coercion, whether it's by sanctions or military use of force rather than diplomacy, is inherently off-putting for other countries. It does breed a reaction. This was exemplified at Anchorage in the approach to the Chinese that the new Biden administration took. But we went in and we said, "You are moral reprobates. We despise you. If we can hold you back, we will. If we can push you back, we will. But by the way, there are a few things we need to work together on. Would you do it with us?" This is the very opposite of diplomacy. Maximum pressure on Iran or North Korea, whatever. 70 years of, or 63 years, I guess, of sanctions on Cuba. These things just we don't appear to learn from the failure of these efforts, and indeed worse than failure. The most effective use of sanctions in history was our embargo on steel and oil exports to Japan in 1941, the summer. We got their attention, and they responded at Pearl Harbor. But I look at, for example, the technology issue. China now has 1/4 or more of the world's STEM workforce, and the proportion is growing. And the Chinese are incredibly inventive now. We see it mostly in the financial and the military sectors. They were the ones who came up with a carrier killer, a terminally guided ballistic missile to hit ships at motion in sea. Their air-to-air missiles outrange ours. Their hypersonic missiles exist, ours don't. They have railguns on their ships, which we failed to be able to do. What I see, and I no longer visit China because I'm old and I don't like to travel, but what I see is a technology race in which we are cutting ourselves off from the greatest pool of scientific and technological talent in the world. And we're also trying to cut them off from global markets and failing. We are dividing the world into different technological ecospheres, and this is not to our advantage. Nokia and Ericsson are great, but they're not an answer to Huawei in terms of what Karaganov calls the global majority. Or we are behaving in a self-destructive manner, and we're risking things that we shouldn't risk. And with regard to the war with China, I have to say it seems to me there's an element of racism here. Wars in Asia take place over there. They don't touch us. And we can always limit the war. The model is Korea, Vietnam. The Chinese didn't. Of course, we forget the Chinese, who had basically nothing in the modern sense, but had just won the Civil War on the mainland, were able to hold us at bay, and more so in Korea. In Vietnam, there were 300,000 Chinese troops in the north. They were railway protection troops for the most part. But I've spoken to Chinese generals who were present with the Vietnamese when the Marines landed in Da Nang in 1965 and observed it. And by the way, they like the Marines. They've modeled some of their forces after them. I think we are foregoing diplomacy at our peril. And the parallel really does exist with Ukraine, where we basically dispense with diplomacy, and we are paying the consequences, and so are the Russians. So is the world. We're working up to the same thing with the Chinese. And I should add, despite the Saudi rapprochement with Iran, which is partial, very much a work in progress, we still have, constant threats from Israel to attack Iran. And the Israeli strategy is to light the fuse and then hope that the Americans blow up and come in and do the job for them. And there's no dialogue at all with Iran. Most awkward proximity talks in Vienna, all gone now. So no diplomacy, and in my country is economic war with much of the world. We have sanctions on all sorts of people. The global war on terrorism, which is an absurdity, is now being conducted in 82 countries. We have piled up a national debt of $8 trillion in current and prospective costs for all of this. We borrow every penny of that. We now have a domestic political scene in which the Republican Party is threatening to repudiate the national debt. So tell me this is rational. It isn't. And it distresses me no end, because in the end, I look at our technological war with China, and I'm concerned about what the damage it will do to us. I'm not worried about the Chinese. They'll take care of themselves. And unfortunately, they will now do it in partnership with Russia.
I like what you said about this, not the age or the opportunities for medium-sized countries, because when I used to work at a university in Moscow, actually for the department of Sergei Karaganov, it's a common friend. Anyways, I spoke to many, well, various ambassadors, including the Turkish ambassador to Russia, and they all kind of had the same thing, that they always got this reaction from Western states that, are they leaving the Western to join Russia? And they always try to explain, no, this is not the Cold War. We are, we have alternatives now. We want to be an independent pole of power, which means we will not be forced to choose between us or them anymore. And I think that's quite important, because in the effort of reasserting unipolarity, I think the US risks creating an unfavorable multipolarity. That is, for example, by pressuring India to stop trading with Iran. Well, then Iran has to go to China instead. This doesn't seem good for the United States. And we see the same with Russia. The United States pressuring the Europeans to cut ties with Russia. Well, Russia goes to China, becomes more dependent on China. So, often we would get the impression that it would be more in the U.S. interest even to support, for example, the Eurasian Economic Union, because that helps to put more of the strengthen Russia's position in Central Asia, as opposed to having this whole region also drift to China. But there's this impulse to undermine all other centers of power, which means that you end up with a very unfavorable multipolar system, which kind of takes me to that last question also I wanted to ask you, which is medium-sized power, obviously Saudi Arabia, because we now see only over the past month with some really groundbreaking developments. First of all, this peace now, the Chinese negotiating this peace between the Saudis and Iran, we see, which apparently the US was blindsided, and also Saudi Arabia restoring its relations with Syria, reopening its embassy. And lastly, this new economic connectivity with China. As I think it was Alexander mentioned earlier, we were now selling oil in, selling its energy in non-dollar currencies. This is the one, of course, but this is all, again, this is the key cornerstone of the petrodollar system. This is all quite extraordinary development. Well, how do you see this fracture, if you will, between the United States and Saudi Arabia impacting, the wider world order?
Well, if you declare that it's your intention to make a country and its leader a pariah, you should not be surprised if they don't welcome that and seek alternatives. The Saudis, over the course, and they're not alone, the other Gulf Arabs as well, the United Arab Emirates is now punching well above its weight internationally in many directions. They watched with horror the American protege Hosni Mubarak in Egypt be displaced, to apparently gleeful reaction in the United States, and they wondered, are we right to depend on a country for our protection that has that sort of reaction? They saw Iranian attacks and other actions on shipping in the Gulf of Hormuz, and there was no effective American reaction. There was an effort made to put together a coalition which didn't succeed, although we did get the mighty Albanian Navy involved in it. I think there's a sense of the United States as erratic, unreliable, and basically all military all the time and not prepared to deal with issues. We ran talks with Iran behind Saudi Arabia's back at a time when they were very concerned about our policies. And so they've gone off on their own, but they're not the only ones. And I would say what's happened in the Middle East is a microcosm of what's happening everywhere. And that is that countries are deciding they don't need external great power patrons. They can make their own decisions. They can work out their own arrangements for the kinds of geopolitical geometry there is in their region. And just to buttress your point, Glenn, consider what Lula has just done. This is Brazil is discounted at your peril. It is an important country and a very large one, and has a major role in all sorts of issues, whether they're climate change or whatever. And it is part of the BRICS, of course, the first letter in BRICS. The BRICS are working on a common currency, on a common trading system, on a common trade dispute settlement system, and they are open to membership from other medium-sized powers, including Saudi Arabia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was founded by Russia and China really to keep Islamist terrorists and extremists at bay, has now evolved into much more. It is beginning to amalgamate with the Eurasian Economic Union, and it is beginning to develop ties with the BRICS, overlap with the BRICS. And by the way, when you tell India not to trade with Iran, India gives you a rude gesture that does not respond. Is anybody in charge? No, nobody is in charge. Is that frustrating for a country that for 150 years was the greatest economy and political force on the planet? Of course. Do we deal with that psychologically well? No, we don't. There's an American self-regard at stake, rather like the concept of face in China. Face is the self-regard you derive from the regard of others. Others respect me, therefore I'm respectable, therefore I respect myself. All of the things that Alex or Alexandra, I don't know which you prefer, listed are directly eroding that self-respect.
Well, I'm not sure if we should make that the final note, or Alexandra, do you have any final comments before we wrap up?
No, I don't have. Just to say, first of all, thank you very much for those insights. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the details of what people like Nixon were like, but that's obviously outside the scope of this program. And I mean, being there, I mean, at those times, I wish people would go back and look back to that time. And I remember international relations. It's just on the cusp of my memory. In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a diplomacy in the United States in those days. It was very good. The United States did diplomacy at that time, and it did it as well or better than anyone. And of course, the United States was indisputably the most powerful country in the world then. And look how it worked for it doing diplomacy at that time. Now, by some metrics, the United States is less powerful and has to deal with more countries, it's decided that it doesn't need diplomacy anymore, or at least some people in the United States have decided that. And that is an extraordinary thing and such a huge mistake. And, well, just look back, look at what was achieved back in the late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, thereafter. Look at people like, Nixon, Kissinger, whatever you may think of their morals and their personalities. Look at George Shultz, look at Cyrus Vance, look at people like that. Well, and see what they managed. Why can't we do that?
These were statesmen of stature.
Yeah.
But perhaps they were somewhat lacking in morality on occasion, but they got useful results. And diplomacy in those years consisted for the United States largely of alliance management, which we became very good at. We actually had an alliance in NATO that was defensive, that respected Europeans, that was in dialogue constantly with Europeans, and which created the software for multinational interoperability on the battlefield, which the Warsaw Pact never did because of the lack of respect that the Russians had for their satellite auxiliaries. Alliance management does seem to be an art from the past, notwithstanding the unity we've achieved in the face of Russian provocation. But perhaps if you go back to that age, and here I'm criticizing my own diplomatic colleagues, Perhaps what we were doing was less diplomacy than imperial administration. And the two are quite different. I've studied both the Roman and the Han Dynasty Chinese systems of imperial administration, and they are very legalist. That is to say, they consist of the administration of punishments more than they do of inducements. All sticks, no carrots. And perhaps we learned that lesson, and that was the wrong lesson to learn for the new age of disorder, which we have entered.
Well, that's quite a thought, actually. It's a completely new thought to me. But if I may say so, Ambassador, you were there. You were there in the 70s.
Not an achievement. You just have to live at the right time, you know. And I will be happy to discuss the strange character of Mr. Nixon or Mr. Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, all of whom I knew reasonably well. George Shultz, you're right, was an absolute gem of a man of principle, a clear-thinking person, empathetic, a great contributor to many things, and I miss him. We don't have his like in evidence very much of anywhere at the moment. So, on that sad thought, then perhaps we should. I hope you will cut out the telephone calls and so on. I'm sorry about those. I'm a victim of. I have a telephone system in my new residence in New Hampshire that evidently was part of some international conspiracy involving smuggling or something, because I get calls, tax calls from Israel, from Poland, from South Africa, from whatever. People imagining that whatever criminal had this number before still has it. So not much I can do about it.
Oh.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your generosity and your time.
It was a great pleasure to meet you face to face, all of you, both of you. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks again, Ambassador. It's been a great pleasure.